Historical American Girl Read Alouds. Today I'm starting out showing you the American Girl timeline that I made of all the historical dolls in the collection. So I made my timeline starting in 1765 and running all the way to 2000. The last historical doll that American Girl has made right now is 1974. But I wanted to kind of be able to see where we are in time compared to the dolls. So here's 2000. 2020 would be somewhere over here. So in the Felicity book, we have gone all the way back to almost the very beginning of this timeline. Here we are with Felicity. She lived in 1774. That's what it says here on her little sign. You can see she's in her riding dress, and Elizabeth is in the pink riding dress. So they're almost the oldest dolls in the collection. The only one older is Kaya. Kaya's date was 1764, so about 10 years before Felicity. I had hoped to do the Kaya series already, but I wanted to do it outside and it got too hot. So Kaya's going to hopefully be the next series that I do. So after Felicity and Elizabeth appears in some of the later books. Then the next historical doll is in 1812, and that's Caroline. I don't have her yet, but I hope to have her someday. Josefina, I have done her meat book, and she was from 1824. Cecile and Marie Grace are from 1853, and they live in New Orleans. I don't have anything from their collection, but I hope to have them someday, along with Kirsten. She's a pioneer, and she was from 1854. So hopefully I'll add some of those to the collection later. Then we go to 1864 with Addie. And Addie comes right around the time of the Civil War. She and her family were slaves that are freed. And so she has some very interesting stories about what it would have been like for Black Americans who had been slaves after the war. Then there's quite a gap in the series. Samantha and Nellie are in 1904. And I do have Samantha. I have quite a few of her things. In fact, I'm making a dollhouse for her. So one of these days we'll hopefully have a Victorian dollhouse to go with the Meet Samantha book. Next is 1914 with Rebecca, who I do not have. But I do have Kit. And that was my very first series. She lives in 1934, and I already have the Meet Kit series. If you haven't watched it, it's on my channel. Next is Nanea. She lived in Hawaii in 1941 before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and World War II. I don't have her, but I do have Emily and Molly. This is Molly, that's Emily. I do have them, and they lived during the time of World War II. So eventually we'll do a Meet Molly series. I don't have any of the other dolls after Molly and Emily. Mary Ellen lived during 1954, during the poodle skirt kind of era. Then Melody in 1964. And then last Julie and Ivy in 1974, which is almost my time. I would have been 4 in 1974. So that gives you kind of a picture of where we are in history. I like to look at timelines because they give us a good picture of how long ago we're talking in time. Sometimes the numbers are a little bit hard to picture, but here we are, 2020, past the end of my timeline. Kit was the most recent doll that I have done so far, the Meet Kit books in 1934. And then Felicity that we're wrapping up today is about 150 years before Kit lived. It's a really long time, 150 years. You can see how much the clothing changes and the style of life changes, the things that they do, the houses they live in. And I think it's a great way to see history. In this episode, we're going to read the last section of the book Meet Felicity, called Looking Back, A Peek into the Past. And this is the section of the book that just has true facts, more information about what life during Felicity's time would be like. Doesn't tell any more of her story, but tells what her life would have been like. So to start out today, I have something that's totally not fact. You would never have seen this during the colonial period, and that's a horse coming to tea in the house. But I think Felicity probably would have tried to do something like that if she could have gotten away with it. And I thought it would just be kind of fun, because I've shown you everything I have so far in my Felicity collection, except this dress. She is wearing her most fancy dress today. It's kind of a, like a silky fabric, really, really fancy and pretty. In one of the later books, you'll find out where she gets this really special dress. It has a lot of meaning to her. And in the last chapter, it talked about her having a red coral necklace, and she is wearing her red coral necklace today too. So Felicity and the horse are going to sit here having tea, which would not be a true fact, while I tell you some true facts. America in 1774. When Felicity was a young girl, she lived in Virginia, one of the 50 states in the United States of America today. Back in 1774, Virginia was one of the 13 colonies of England. The map there says, in 1774, the colony of Virginia claimed the dark green area on this map. And that was interesting to me. I didn't realize that Virginia covered all those other states when it was a colony. In the picture we have Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and looks like maybe even parts of Minnesota were all considered part of the Virginia colony at this time. The picture at the top of this page says, "The girl looking at you is Elizabeth Copley. She and her family were painted in 1777 by her father, John Singleton Copley, who is standing in the back." So that gives you a good picture of some of the clothing they might have worn as children and the pretty sofa there on the side. A colony is a group of people who settle in a new land but follow a different country's laws. People came to the colonies so that they could have a better life, own land, or worship freely. But the English were not the first to settle in America, because Native American Indians had lived in America for at least 15,000 years. When Felicity was a young girl, most Virginia families lived on farms, but some lived in towns like Williamsburg. If you had walked down a street in Williamsburg, you would have seen a town buzzing with activity. Farmers came to town to sell their goods. Visitors came to see the latest English entertainments and fashions from Europe. Merchants came to do business. People who lived in the country came to shop at stores like Mr. Merriman's. The picture to the right says farms in rural Virginia looked like this in Felicity's time. So most people at this time lived on farms like that, not like Felicity did. But then they would go to town and shop at a place like her dad's shop. At the top of the page, it shows you what an Indian village would have looked like when the first British colonists came over. It says the first British colonists in Virginia saw Indian villages like this one. You can see dancing and feasting if you look closely. The type of houses that are pictured there are called long houses. They're kind of dome-shaped and they're long. That's how they got the name long houses. and they're usually made of wood because there was lots of trees in that area. During Felicity's time, people liked things to be elegant, graceful, and orderly. Colonists built homes that were balanced, often with the same number of windows to the left and to the right of the front door. Gardens were also orderly, with flowers, fruit trees, and vegetables arranged in beautiful patterns. People's clothes showed how rich they were. Wealthy gentlemen wore velvet and silk suits with fancy trims. They wore pants called breeches that stopped at the knee with silk stockings below. Gentlemen also wore wigs that were powdered, braided, and decorated with ribbons. Young boys like Felicity's brother William wore loose dresses until the age of 4 or 5, and then dressed like their fathers. The gardens at the top picture say, "This colonial Williamsburg garden shows how wealthy colonists copied the patterns of gardens in England." Then the next picture, colonist homes looked balanced from the front. Felicity's house would not have been as large as this one. And at the bottom is what seems kind of silly to me, the wig that men used to wear. It was powdered, so it was kind of white looking and had ribbons and stuff in it, and it just seems odd today, but that's what the fancy men wore at that time, both in England and in the colonies. So a lot of times when you see pictures of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, some of the people who were part of the revolution and starting the new government, when you see pictures of them, they're all wearing these white powdered wigs that were fashionable at the time. Wealthy women wore long gowns made of many yards of fine fabric and lace. Under these gowns, they wore simple cotton shifts and stays that fit tightly around their bodies to give a fashionable figure. Girls dressed like small copies of their mothers and wore stays from the time they were very young. People who were not so wealthy wore simpler clothes made from plainer material. At the picture at the top, it says, "In this painting by Stephen Slaughter, you can see how young girls of Felicity's age dressed." So they're wearing pretty fancy dresses, kind of like the one Felicity has on today, but their dresses poofed out quite a bit more because of the petticoats and things they wore underneath them that we don't really have. I don't know if American Girl made it or not, but my Felicity doll doesn't have anything to poof her skirts out quite as much as they did in the picture. The picture in the middle we saw earlier in the Felicity story, where it is a humorous illustration showing stays being laced up. Sometimes women fainted from wearing such tight corsets. And at the bottom, a fashionable fan was part of a girl's outfit for any special occasion. So colonists were about being fancy. Dining was an art in colonial Virginia. Colonists took pride in setting an elegant table with a grand centerpiece. Virginia colonists loved to make visitors feel welcome with a beautifully set table. Dinner, served in the afternoon, consisted of at least 2 courses and sometimes lasted for many hours. There might be crabs and oysters from Chesapeake Bay, several kinds of meat, fruits, breads, vegetables of every kind, and for dessert, fancy cakes, puddings, and tarts. The picture kind of in the middle top there says this elegant centerpiece is called an apron. It held desserts like dried fruits and nuts called sweetmeats. Fancy plates had paintings of fruit, flowers, insects, and birds on them. And at the bottom, the Shirley Plantation in Virginia is furnished in the style of the 18th century. So that picture shows you a lot of details about what Felicity's house and others at that time might have looked like. But not everyone in Williamsburg had fine food, elegant clothing, and beautiful homes. Half the people who lived in the town were African American slaves, such as Marcus. They were forced to work long and hard for the person who owned them. They got little in return except basic food, clothing, and shelter. An apprentice, like Ben, lived with a family for several years to work and learn a skill. However, an apprentice had the hope of a good life when the apprenticeship was over and he went out into the world to work on his own. Today you can visit the town where Felicity grew up and see many of the buildings that were lived in long ago. Colonial Williamsburg is a living history museum, open to visitors all year. You can taste colonial food and listen to music played on colonial instruments. You can see people dressed in colonial clothes and shop in colonial stores. You can pretend that you are Felicity living in the colony of Virginia more than 200 years ago. At the top it says white landowners purchased Africans to work and live as their slaves in the colonies. So even though the United States fights for their freedom from England at this time period and fights the Revolutionary War, not everybody was free when the United States first became a country in 1776. Slavery was around for quite a while longer, about 100 years longer, until the Civil War, which I showed you on the timeline where Addie lives. At the bottom it says, "Today Williamsburg welcomes thousands of visitors each year who come to see people working as they did in colonial times." You might remember I told you in one of the other episodes about Felicity that it was at Colonial Williamsburg that the woman who started American Girl got inspired to start the line of dolls and to help tell about their time period through the accessories and furniture and clothing and stories of American Girl. I will try to put a link on my YouTube channel to Colonial Williamsburg so you can look around and see some of the things that you might see in person if you ever get a chance to go there. So if you look at the top right corner of the channel, there should be a link to Colonial Williamsburg, along with the link to the ranch of Josefina that shows what life was like in her time period. So that's the end of Meet Felicity. I hope you enjoyed the Felicity stories, and I hope you'll be back in the next series I think is going to be